You get Charles Dance playing a disapproving father, and it works. It works every time. So if you can, you might as well do it.
Let's just say I'm Frankenstein's monster.
Say it out loud.
Frankenstein!
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
My name, it's pronounced Frankenstein.
Welcome back to Franken-Fridays. Today we are talking about Victor Frankenstein. The one with James McAvoy as Victor Frankenstein and Daniel Radcliffe as Igor, or EyeGor, depending on how you pronounce it.
But they told me it was Igor.
Well, they were wrong then, weren't they?
So this one is actually, I think, kind of interesting. It's not trying to just retell the same Frankenstein story, but it is taking the iconography and the characters and trying to dive into telling sort of an origin character story about Igor and Victor. This one was written by Max Landis, who is kind of a weird guy. He got canceled a few years ago and probably could have gone down the alt-right grifter route, but instead he just makes like weird Superman fan fiction on his YouTube channel. So I don't know, you be the judge, I guess. But he had like a few hit movies around the early 2010s. This one was 2015? Okay. So yeah, a little bit after I, Frankenstein, but still within that kind of era of like, hey, maybe let's give Frankenstein another shot. Chronicle was probably his big hit, and he wrote a couple other movies with varying degrees of success. But I think this one is mostly pretty solid. The standouts here are, I think it's mostly a very solid script, and also the performances by Daniel Radcliffe and James McAvoy. Despite being called Victor Frankenstein, the movie is actually kind of more about Igor. He's kind of the point of view character. We see a lot of the scenes from his perspective. He narrates like the opening of the film, which is an interesting character to kind of dive into because, well, one, as we've talked about before, not a character at all in the book and barely a character in the early movies. But the concept of a hunchback guy who was the assistant to Victor Frankenstein became one of the big iconic Frankenstein things, that it's one of those like concepts that became so like part of the pop culture iconography of the story that people kind of assumed it was always there. And so like this one is like, hey, well, that's an interesting character. Let's dive into him and what his deal is.
What's his story?
And in this, he has a whole origin of he used to be part of this freak show circus and was a hunchback and all this stuff. But he was actually like this really smart artist and scientist who was like into studying anatomy. He ends up coming across Victor Frankenstein, and Victor's like, hey, want to come work for me and do science stuff, do some weird science? So he ends up rescuing him from this kind of abusive freak show circus thing, and then they go off and do science together. And it's just like about their friendship as these two scientists, like learning and studying and like trying to figure out, is it possible to make a guy out of a box of scraps in a cave? And James McAvoy is so much fucking fun to watch in this movie. This is right before Split, so when we realized that actually James McAvoy is kind of great in horror movies, and in this one he is so much fun to watch as this mad doctor. He's like extremely intelligent, but in a way that makes him like very arrogant and very like, I don't have time for regular people and their dumb bullshit. He's also just like kind of weird and socially awkward, but his obsession with the possibilities of science are also really infectious and engaging. He has a weird charisma about him, despite being like a little bit like fucking, I don't know if I trust this guy. And McAvoy plays it perfectly. His performance is just like so engaging and so much fun to watch. And he has this really interesting back and forth with Igor, who is kind of the heart of the movie, and really like, because Victor saw like humanity in Igor, who had been cast aside by society, Igor feels that he kind of owes Frankenstein his life. And because of that, he's a lot more sympathetic to him, even though he knows that Frankenstein may have gone too far in a few places, such as making a guy out of old dead people. There's a lot of stuff in this that I think is really strong and creative in the way that they kind of throw out a lot of the stuff that Mary Shelley was doing and do something totally different. A big part of what makes Frankenstein the character actually kind of likable and relatable in the book and a lot of the other adaptations that stick more closely to that material is that Frankenstein has like loved ones. He has a family, he has parents that care about him, he has a love interest. But this movie's like, you know what, fuck all that. You know what's more compelling? Having Charles Dance play a disapproving father for one scene. And you know what? You get Charles Dance playing a disapproving father, and it works. It works every time. So if you can, you might as well do it. And yeah, moments like that I think are actually kind of clever and brilliant in their simplicity and show more about the character, this version of the character at least, than spending all this time showing that he has a loving family and he's worth sympathy. It's like, or maybe his dad hates him and that's actually more interesting. I don't know. It's kind of cool. For the most part, I actually really dig this one. However, I do think it falls apart a little bit towards the end of the movie when they actually finally make the creature. The build up to that whole sequence is like, you know, a big chunk of the movie, and all of that stuff I think is really great. There's a lot of great scenes of Victor and Igor doing different experiments and trying to figure out how to make a guy. There's this really fun sequence when they're like fully designing the creature, and they're like, we need him to be like 8 feet tall for whatever reasons. I think it's because they need to shoot more lightning into him or something. But they're like, well, a guy that big wouldn't work physically. And Igor's like, well, what if we gave him 2 hearts and 2 sets of lungs and stuff? So then they like figure out how to fit all these extra organs in a guy that big, and they get drunk while they're designing him.
Flat head.
Why?
Why? Because I like it, that's why.
It's a really fun sequence, and all the stuff of them like doing experiments and figuring out how to make a guy is really great. But then when we actually kind of get to the point where they make a guy, it kind of devolves into like a weird, kind of goofy video game boss fight action sequence. And it's just kind of like the least interesting thing of the whole movie. I almost wish the movie ended like a little bit earlier, because there's this great scene where Igor and Victor are kind of having their like, what would be their final goodbye if they didn't have to do a boss fight in like 2 scenes, where they kind of realize that their lives and their paths have just kind of are gonna go in different directions, and what they're starting to realize that they're mourning is the loss of their friendship. And that scene is really fucking great. It's all the stuff from X-Men First Class when Xavier and Magneto, their friendship falls apart, but almost executed slightly better in some ways. I don't know. I have some problems with First Class, although I really like that movie as well. But that's a different time. That's a different topic. That's a different Frankenstein's monster.
Let's just say I'm Frankenstein's monster.
But yeah, just the ending final boss fight is kind of goofy and weirdly rushed through the big part of the Frankenstein story, which is them making a guy and all the implications of that. And they don't like go into any of those, which is like kind of strange. But that's, I think, just sort of what this movie wasn't trying to be. And this is one of those things that I've heard. There were several different drafts of the script, and this was not the original intended ending, which makes sense because I don't think it is that good. But I also get like why the studio would want to have a Frankenstein's monster appear in a Frankenstein movie. So I don't know what the solution is to that specifically. Do you make this just a full-on prequel, everything leading up to them making the monster, and leave the audience maybe a little bit unsatisfied? Or do you just do that and leave the audience unsatisfied anyways because you're rushing through the thing that is the crux of the original story? I don't know. I think I prefer to just like commit to making this movie what it is, which is a story about Victor and Igor and their friendship and how it ends up falling apart in the end. And that's the real tragedy of this version of the story. That is far more interesting to me than whether or not they succeed in making a guy, only because that's not what this story is about. So yeah, I think that's all my main thoughts. mostly, this one was pretty good, especially elevated by two great lead performances and our first clue that James McAvoy would have a strong career in the horror genre. And I hope he continues to do more horror movies because he's great. That's this one, I think. Stay tuned and subscribe, and we'll talk more about Frankenstein in the next one. Bye-bye.